A few weeks ago, after Lindsey Graham finally dropped out of the presidential campaign, I posted a video expressing the hope that a number of other Republican also-rans would follow his lead, if only to free up some space for a viable non-Donald Trump candidate to emerge in the Republican campaign. Well, just in the past 24 hours or so, it would seem, I've actually been granted my wish, or at least I've begun to be granted my wish. In the wake of Donald Trump's fortunate loss in the Iowa caucuses just the other day, two Republican candidates who weren't doing too well in the polls have since announced that they are dropping out of the presidential race. Rick Santorum most recently, and also, of course, Rand Paul. Now, in that video from a couple of weeks ago, I had this to say about the possibility of Rand Paul in particular suspending his presidential campaign. That's why it's important that supporters of candidates like Chris Christie and, I'm sorry to say, Rand Paul, I mean, he's the only libertarian-leaning candidate in the race, so as a libertarian, I find him the only Republican candidate whom I could really stomach, and it's too bad to see that he's so far behind. With a heavy heart, I would recommend that people like Rand Paul at least consider dropping out and relatively early in the race so that they can, allow more realistic and likely alternatives to Donald Trump to emerge as soon as possible. I meant that then, and I mean it now. From what I understand, he has just recently been hit with a serious challenger for his Senate seat from Kentucky. He was first elected in 2010, and of course senators are elected to 6-year terms, so this year is when he has to defend his seat. Supposedly Paul is still the front runner in that race, but as the Atlantic magazine put it online, and I quote, "The advent of a well-funded challenger meant that Paul couldn't really waste any more time on a presidential campaign that was clearly going nowhere." Although it's too bad that Paul didn't do better in this campaign, I'm not as torn up by this news as a lot of my fellow libertarians are. A lot of my libertarian friends, particularly the ones I made when I was living in DC, were big fans of Rand Paul and frankly supported and even worked for his presidential campaign. So a lot of them are really down in the dumps right about now. My message to them and to all like-minded voters and Rand Paul supporters out there is, look at the big picture. Personally, I suspect, and frankly I suspected all along, for the past year or so, if not even more, that Rand Paul would actually be able to do the cause of liberty across the board a lot more good from his perch in the Senate than necessarily from the White House. I've been glad to see someone like Rand Paul emerge in the Republican Party. He is a very worthy heir to his father, Ron Paul. Ron Paul sort of laid the groundwork. He was the politician who, more than anyone else, put libertarian ideas on the map, both in the Republican Party and in politics more generally. And now Rand Paul has taken that ball, and although he's not a full-fledged libertarian, he's more of a conservative who leans libertarian, which is why I never did support him wholeheartedly. We have enough fundamental differences on a number of issues that I wouldn't have necessarily given him my support. Nonetheless, I was glad to see him take a more pragmatic and just generally electable and politically viable approach to trying to advance liberty more consistently across the board in the social, economic, and foreign policy realms, especially in that last category when it comes to foreign policy. I was especially delighted to see him take the stage at Republican debates and strongly represent the non-interventionist viewpoint in foreign policy in a sea of Republican hawkishness, and especially was hoping that he would be able to disabuse a lot more Republican politicians, activists, and voters of this notion that not being an interventionist somehow makes a person an isolationist, which is such a crock, if you ask me. But it was not to be, at least not in this particular presidential campaign. Nonetheless, I think Rand Paul has been able to do some good work in his Senate career so far. Not necessarily in terms of getting actual legislation passed, but he has done good work in terms of putting certain issues on the map and showing that Republicans can pay those issues proper attention without totally selling out their principles and losing their identity. So, of course, he did that filibuster on the Senate floor where he filibustered CIA Director John Brennan's nomination in order to really bring public attention to the issue of mass surveillance and the drone war and things of that nature. He reached out to black voters and others when it came to issues like criminal justice reform, which is definitely an issue where libertarians in general should be at the forefront. Frankly, a lot of libertarian policy scholars and commentators and analysts already are at the forefront of that issue, more than either liberals or conservatives. Many liberals, at least, and more than most conservatives. And I would like to see the handful of libertarian politicians who are already in the game really be at the forefront of those efforts as well. So I would like to see Rand Paul stay in the Senate, frankly, and continue those efforts. I would hope to see more libertarian or at least libertarian-leaning politicians join him, not only in the Senate, but also in the House of Representatives, and of course, at the state and local level as well, because a lot of the policies in America that make America a much less free country than it really could or should be are implemented at the state and local level, as well as at the federal level. So I don't really bemoan Senator Paul's decision to drop out of the presidential race. He does need to focus on his Senate re-election campaign. I would like to see him be re-elected. I think he can do a lot of good and put libertarian ideas, or continue to put them on the map in a big way in the Senate. And frankly, look at the big picture when it comes to the American system of government. In the American system of government, the legislature is a lot more independent of the executive branch than it is in certain other democratic systems, such as the British Westminster parliamentary system in my own home country of Canada, where the executive branch is in theory supposed to be held accountable by the legislature, by parliament, but in practice, the executive usually runs roughshod over parliament. Certainly in Canada, not as much as in the UK itself, but certainly in Canada. It's really the executive branch that runs the show, especially when the government of the day, the governing party, has a majority of seats in parliament. But in the United States, there is a much stronger separation of powers between the executive and legislative branches, and that gives the legislature, especially in domestic politics, a lot more clout. So in American politics, in order for the ideas of liberty to really be reflected in public policy more and more, we need voices like Rand Paul in Congress, not necessarily in the White House. Frankly, on the domestic front, the president is a lot less powerful than he or she would be on the foreign policy front anyway. So when it comes to domestic issues, we need as many voices like Rand Paul as possible to stay and hopefully accumulate in Congress. So that's really my takeaway from Senator Paul's decision to drop out of the race. I think he might actually be able to do more good as a senator than as a president, at least for the time being. Given the American system of government and the way it works, senators and legislators in general can make a great deal of difference in their own right as well. You don't have to be a governor or a mayor or a president in order to make a difference. You can make a great difference as a legislator as well. If you look at American history, senators like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster made huge strides and a lot of decisions that determined the course of American history. So I hope that in the future, Senator Paul will end up serving that kind of purpose and filling that kind of role in American politics. Frankly, given the vision of the framers of the Constitution and the Founding Fathers, Congress was really supposed to be at the forefront of national policy making anyway, not the president. So if anything, we should seek to have more and more Rand Pauls in Congress and not necessarily feel that they have to make it to the White House in order to make a difference. So don't lose hope, all those Paul supporters out there. Don't lose heart. Stick your courage to the post. Continue to support your man as he fights to get reelected and to stay in the Senate and to continue to fight for the cause of liberty in American life from Congress.